Let's get feisty. I'm Sylvana Sambaea, and I'm an author, editor, menace, and master's degree haver. For the past year, I was a student in Western Colorado University's Publishing MA program, and last month I graduated. Yay. Now everyone who meets me has to bow down in the streets, English majors are legally obligated to obey my every command in battle, and books quiver before me, all because I have a $20,000 piece of paper telling the world that I'm better than everyone. Okay, so I don't actually have my diploma yet, but once I do, all of that is totally going to happen. I just hope it doesn't show up bent this time like my undergrad degree. We got an envelope at the house that said, "Do not bend" on the front, and it was bent, and my diploma is bent, and you might even say that I'm bent. I'm not still bitter about it after all these years or anything. Anyway, I want to pass my knowledge on to you, and I think the best way to do that is to take you on a journey of books. Swivel. Before you are all the books I have acquired either because of or over the course of my master's degree, and each of them represents a step in my journey from pathetic little undergrad worm to master of publishing. So this isn't a video essay, it's more of a casual chat / book haul, but if you're interested in writing and publishing yourself, or especially if you're considering going to Western Colorado University, there's a lot of useful information here in store for you, so stay tuned. I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was 5 years old, and I've known I wanted to be an editor since high school. I majored in English, also picking up a certificate in Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asian Area Studies, and I scraped out of there with a 3.01 GPA by the skin of my teeth. I was going through it. I had mysterious health issues at the time that severely impacted my vision, so I had a hard time keeping up with my classes and got absolute dog shit grades for 2 years straight. Senior year, I found a treatment that worked, got straight A's that first semester, and was looking forward to tackling my thesis, which eventually got a second place Eudora Welty Fiction Thesis Prize. Yep, 2020 was going to be my year. I graduated over Zoom, you guys. So, did I get a master's degree just so I could have a real college graduation experience? Of course not. Did I use my 2020 graduation as an excuse to guilt trip my whole family into attending the hooding ceremony? You bet your biscuits. And graduation wasn't even the best part. While students in other writing concentrations had thesis readings, the publishing concentration had a book launch where all the student editors got to sell and sign copies of the classic reprint they spent the past year editing, as well as the class anthology featuring editors from around the globe. Literally, just at the event in July, we had author Matt Beswick come all the way from England. It was his first publication, so it was a really special occasion for him. I ended up sharing a table with him at dinner, and he was so nice. He wrote the short story Orphans, which you can read for yourself in Feisty Felines and Other Fantastical Familiars, link in the description. I feel like a real YouTuber. Anyway, I got my aforementioned English degree, proceeded to do fuck all with it for a few years, and then was encouraged to apply to grad school by Julia O'Malley, a journalist who ran a writing workshop that I attended. That workshop actually resulted in a creative nonfiction piece I wrote being published in Shattermarks, the Anchorage Museum's quarterly journal. And this was a free local workshop, which just goes to show that even if you don't have the time and money to commit to formal education or any kind of big fancy workshops, there are opportunities out there for you. You just have to be on the lookout. Originally, I was planning to get a more traditional creative writing MA or MFA, but Julia convinced me that if I wanted to be an editor, it would make more sense to get a master's in publishing. I didn't even realize that was a thing, which shows you how much research I did into the whole grad school thing going in, but once I had this direction in mind, I pursued it. Western Colorado University's program stood out to me for a couple of reasons. One, it was cheap. Anyone who knows me knows that I hate spending money, so this was a top priority for me. Most of the other programs I was looking at ranged from between $30 to $60K, but the Western program was closer to $20. It was also a one-year program, 4 semesters over 1 calendar year, while the others were all 2 or 3. This alone probably would have made it my top choice, but Western's website also talked about the Publishing Concentration's book launch, which sounded like so much fun, and I loved the idea of going to a school that did that. I know there was another program I looked into that did something similar, but it was way more expensive, and I think also located in Boston. Oh, no thank you. Boston isn't even real. They just made it up for that Casey Affleck SNL Dunkin' Donuts sketch. Anyway, I applied late November, and in December, the program director wanted to do an interview, and that is when I met Kevin J. Anderson. This is an emergency. Someone get me a hot beverage and a copy of a Kevin J. Anderson novel. I think we need an ASMR break. Okay, I don't have like a beverage to swill out of this, but just pretend I'm like drinking wine like every other video essayist. My takes are really gonna pop off now that I'm white girl wasted. Kevin Janderson is a celebrity author whom no one I've ever spoken to has heard of, but you've probably heard of series he's written for, such as Dune and Star Wars. You know those Star Wars books from the 90s that Disney decided aren't canon anymore? That's Kevin. You know, in the sequel to Dune, written by Frank Herbert's son and some other guy, Kevin is that other guy. He's even involved with the Dune TV series that's coming out soon, and apparently his name appears in the movie credits as some kind of creative advisor. In the words of my dear friend Evelyn, "Oh wow, you meant like actually, like I believed you, but I didn't realize he was offering a direct wiki link in the summary portion of the very first book's Wikipedia page. Good for him, I guess." Good for him indeed. Sadly though, he did not design the Dune 2 popcorn bucket. F in chat. And I feel comfortable sharing the fact that I didn't have the best first impression of him because he also had a bad first impression of me. See, the thing about me is, I'm pretentious. I have strong ideals about my writing and what I want it to accomplish. I can and will make any conversation about Vladimir Nabokov, and I wrote my application essay in the second person to, like, stand out or something. It was ill-advised, he didn't like it, he hated it, in fact, and it pretty much made up his mind before even meeting me that he didn't want me within 10,000 miles of his program. But you know, people are complex. The J in Kevin J. Anderson might stand for jumping at the bit to inform you why you too should be a member of the Kevin J. Anderson fan club, but he is sincerely passionate about mentoring the next generation of writers and increasing opportunities for people within the publishing industry. Still, knowing that this man did not like me, I was genuinely surprised when I got my acceptance letter a couple weeks later. I later found out that the assistant director, the wonderful Alison Longiera, actually did like me, and that probably helped, as did the fact that Kevin and I shared alma mater, Go Badgers. Later, he said he was impressed with how I handled myself, probably because he told me to my face that my writing was not impressive, and I took it in stride. This is something I think a lot of writers struggle with that is essential to get past if you want to succeed. You can't argue with an opinion. If someone's opinion of your writing is that it's not impressive, then you didn't impress them. End of story. They have every right to their own perspective. You don't have to agree with every opinion everyone voices. You don't even have to listen most of the time. But arguing will get you nowhere. Let your writing speak for itself. Not everyone is going to like what you have to say or how you say it, but at the end of the day, all you can do is your best. The more experimental, artsy, and yes, pretentious you are in your writing, the harder it is to find your audience, but there are audiences out there for everything. There are readers who chew books up and spit them out like they're binging Netflix. There are literature freaks who read because they're looking for a challenge. And there's people on the spectrum ranging everywhere in between. It's just a matter of knowing what you want to accomplish as an artist and understanding how you can get that art into the hands of people who will engage with it. The problem with my application essay was that I didn't know my audience, so the tone was all wrong. Even though I could go line by line defending every artistic choice that I made in that admissions essay, that doesn't matter because I didn't succeed in its purpose. That brings us to the first two books I want to show you today, Clockwork Angels and Clockwork... I'm holding it backwards. Clockwork Angels and Clockwork Destiny, both by Kevin J. Anderson and Neil Peart. If that second name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was the drummer of Rush. These are book 1 and book 3 of the series, and just to complicate things even further, I got book 3 first. After my interview, I told my whole family that the guy running the program was A, famous, and B, didn't like me, so my brother naturally decided it would be the funniest thing in the world to get me one of Kevin's books for Christmas. I don't think he realized it was part of a series. That's also why, this past year for my birthday, my brother pledged to one of Kevin's Kickstarters so he could get me the Kevin J. Anderson mug. Rumor has it that Kevin personally drinks out of each and every one of these. There's still nothing in here. As for the book, this book has an objectively cool cover though. Like, it has the gilding on the front, it's super shiny. It's case bound, which I think makes it stand out, because usually hardcovers have the dust jacket, but it's printed right on here. Shiny. I already mentioned that it's shiny, but I have the braid of a magpie, so forgive me. I'll hold it closer so you can see there's like an airship and like a beast, a creature. It's objectively a very cool cover, and I'm not even someone who's into steampunk. I've just never understood the appeal of it as a genre, and at this point in my life, I doubt I ever will. If you look inside, it has beautiful clockwork end papers, also kind of, they're not quite shiny, but they are golden, so they have the illusion of shininess, which I appreciate. And it has these interesting little glyphs on the side. Hold it up close so you can see. Like, that's just a neat little detail that you don't see in a lot of books. And also, the page numbers are on the side, which isn't something you see very often. I think it's interesting. There's just a lot of cool choices with the layout here. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I still have to read book 1 and 2, but it's definitely a pretty book. So, book 3 was a gift for my brother to take the piss out of me, and book 1 was also a gift. I keep holding it backwards. I was not made for book hauls. Is this facing correctly? Yes, Clockwork. It's slipping out of the cover. Let's not do that. Anyway, book 3 was a gift for my brother to take the piss out of me, and book 1 was also a gift, but one that I received under very different circumstances. As discussed, I had beef with Kevin from day one, and I continued to feel a type of way that is perhaps inevitable when interacting with an old white man, even one who I would say is genuinely well-intentioned and interested in increasing diversity in publishing. He's like that uncle that knows you have pronouns TM and is fine with it but doesn't actually use them. You know, that's the vibe. Also, for anyone curious what it was like to get a master's degree while openly queer and non-binary and using they, them pronouns, it was a lot less scary than I thought. I have never been fully out in any kind of academic setting, but Western Colorado University is a pretty friendly organization on the whole, and my cohort in particular was wonderful. I wasn't constantly afraid that I was going to get hate crimed or anything. I also didn't really feel comfortable correcting people when they didn't use my pronouns, which is mostly what happened, but that says more about me than them. I just don't like setting boundaries. But you know, people would talk about their partners, and I could talk about mine, who's also non-binary, likes to be called my girlfriend, and it was fine, it was fun. I got to advocate for queer authors, more on that later, and I got to be part of a discussion that led to the anthology author contracts being rewritten with they, them pronouns instead of saying he or she. It was really cool. I realized that being out is terrifying, but the more of us there are, the more comfortable we'll all feel in the long run. So I think it's important to be as open as you can while still ensuring your own safety. Not just for yourself, but for the people who will see your openness and know that they're safe in the community. Also, I want to shout out Allison Laguerra once again. I am giving her the Ally of the Year award because her daughter, who's also super sweet and cool, way too cool to be watching this channel, was talking about recognizing me and said, I saw her, and Allison said, you saw them, and it was so nice. Now back to Kevin. The first time I really got a glimpse, I'm holding it backwards again, and upside down. Okay. I'm going to keep it up like this, and you can see the glisten and shine, and believe me, I will talk about the book itself later, because this one has cool illustrations as well. I'll show it off a little more later. I'm still sharing my story of how I came to acquire it. So basically, the first time I really got a glimpse beneath the old white manness of it all and the glaring lights of fame and stardom was last year during my first summer residency. On the last day, just a couple hours before graduation, Kevin gathered all the publishing students together and said goodbye to the graduating cohort. He talked about how passionate he was about ushering in the next generation of authors and publishers and the importance of being a mentor and how much all the students meant to him, and he cried. He cried! A man! Crying! He did that! I can count on one finger the number of times in my life I've seen a man cry before meeting Kevin, so obviously it really shook me to the core and showed me how much sincerity he had within him, and the fact that he was willing and able to share that with everyone was really touching. After his speech, he gave all the graduating students a hug and a copy of Clockwork Angels. This year, it was my turn. This book will always be meaningful to me. It's a reminder that people are more complex than we give them credit for. It's easy to forget when you feel like someone is against you or you disagree, but most people genuinely want to do good, and every person is capable of it. Let's talk about the book. As you can see, the cover is very glossy. It keeps slipping and sliding. There's nothing on the cover, which is okay. You know, a lot of hardcovers are like that. Sometimes they have like the title embossed, but this one doesn't. That's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine, it's fine, it's fine, okay? It's okay. It also has end papers. I like the ones in the other book a little better because they pop a bit more with the gold against the dark background. These are sort of gold against tan, so they don't stand out as much, but they do also have the intricate little clockwork design. They also have the page numbers on the side in the same little glyph. It looks like a nail that you would like drive into a piece of wood. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know if that symbol represents something. It has little overlays on every chapter. You can't see it super well on my dog shit phone camera, but there's a gray background image with sort of like a swirly old parchment sort of pattern, and there's this little trident figure up here. There are also little lyric sort of epigraphs at the start of each chapter. And something that I think makes this book very cool, illustrations! They're very photorealistic. I don't think that they're stock photos because they're very intricate and unique, but they look incredibly realistic. They're in black and white because printing in color is a nightmare, believe me. But like, look, it's just very nice and atmospheric, and I look forward to seeing how these images connect to the story because I really do not know what happens in this one. Strangely enough, the only book that I have any idea what the plot is book 2 in the series, which is the one I don't have. The next book I have for you is this slim little volume. Oh, fuck! Why Why did I do that? I always, when I have a heavy book, I want to just drop it dramatically to show, like, the heft of it, but I dropped it dramatically onto my thigh, and I'm going to have a bruise, and in, like, a week, I'm going to see the bruise and forget how I got the bruise and think I have leukemia because I read the Dawn Rochelle books at an impressionable age. Now, every time I have an unexplainable bruise, I think I have leukemia and I'm dying, but I'm not. I'm just an idiot who dropped the Chicago Manual. I'm going to drop it to the floor now so you can feel the heft. There we go. Don't try that at home, kids. This thing was like $70. Anyway, the Chicago Manual of Style. I had to get this for class, and let me tell you, you might think you have good grammar. You might think you have a firm command of the English language, mayhaps because you have an English degree even. You might think you know where commas, quotation marks, and apostrophes go, and what things get capitalized and what things don't, and how hyphens work, but you don't. You don't. That is your hubris talking. Grammar is unknowable, unfathomable. There is no enlightenment. There is no escape. Shackle yourself to the manual and admit your ignorance, you fool. So, I became well acquainted with Ms. Chicago Manuel last summer when our first real assignment for class is to proofread a copy of High Op by Frank Herbert. For those of you who don't know, Frank Herbert is the Dune guy. However, Dune is his magnum opus, a genre-defining foundational text in science fiction. High Op was an unfinished manuscript published posthumously. High Op, as it stands, is not the optimal version of itself. We will never know what heights Herbert might have reached with it if he only had the chance. We just have the book as it stands, and let me tell you, it's pretty fucking rough, man. Can you believe that a mid-century science fiction book is kind of weird about women? In terms of plot, it's basically 1984, but worse. However, if you are a fan of Frank Herbert, I imagine it's an interesting little artifact and a way to gain insight into the writing process. Also, I feel like getting to say I proofread a book by Frank Herbert, author of Dune, gives me some pretty serious nerd cred. Honey, I proofread Frank Herbert books you've never even heard of. So I don't have a copy of High Op since I just worked off of PDFs. I'm kind of using the Chicago Manual as a stand-in for it. There's not much to say about the manual itself. It's text after text after text after text after text. It's an invaluable resource if you're a proofreader or editor. It's nice to have a reference you can check back to whenever a stupid minor grammar question comes up and you don't feel like being fed AI slop by Google. It has cute little alphabet end papers. That's not what I wanted to show you. I wanted to turn to the table of contents. I have made notes on some of it, because there was a certain page I kept having to refer to, and I kept forgetting where it was in this stupid thing every single time, so I have to go through the table of contents, read through it, then find it. So I took a note there on whether or not you need a comma to introduce quotation. So, because there's some times where you don't, so I had to write that down, because apparently I kept referring back to it so damn much. Also, in a very weird roundabout way, proofreading might have saved my life, not clickbait. When I started this program, I was completely unmedicated, and my OCD, which is already ruining my life for other reasons, became even more life-ruining when it started adding hours to every proofreading assignment with constant checking compulsions. That was what finally pushed me to see a psychiatrist again. That psychiatrist was more concerned about my rampant eating disorder than the OCD, so she referred me to a different psychiatrist, who referred me to a dietitian, and I've been working with both of these people for months now, and while I haven't exactly come out the other end as a shining image of health, I have kept my eating disorder from getting worse, and there wasn't a whole lot worse it could have gotten without some serious consequences, so thank you, Chicago Manual, for forcing me out of my Jokerkin era. I'm just going to breeze through a couple of other books I had to get for class because they're good resources for authors and publishers, but I don't have much to say about them individually. Your Author Business Plan by Joanna Penn, as the title implies, is about creating business plans as an author, which is very useful if you're going to self-publish. So, even if you're not going to self-publish, I still think that you could learn a lot from it. Traditional publishing often leave you on your own with a lot of marketing anyway, so it could still help to pick this up and learn, what you could be doing in terms of, email lists and stuff like that. It's also incredibly short. I could drop this one on my knee and not have a bruise. There we go. I felt nothing. Then we have Mastering Amazon Descriptions by Brian Meeks, which talks about sort of writing the cover copy that you would put on Amazon. And he has a pretty distinct formula that he uses, so I just sort of created a sticky note at the beginning to remind myself what that formula was, and I'll share it with you guys now. I would suggest reading the book just to see, how the formula works and how he puts it into action, but if you just want to hear the Cliff Notes version of it, basically you want to start with a hook to get them engaged and leave them with a question to be answered. Then you want to strike a nerve and make them relate to your story or character. Then you want to address a possible objection that they might have, and then you end with a call to action. And this book provides plenty of examples of how to do just that. Again, if you're looking to self-publish, or even if you just want to get better at writing cover copy, this gives you a pretty distinct way to do it. Another book I want to mention that I have as an ebook, so I'm not going to be able to hold it up for you here, is An Author's Guide to Working with Libraries and Bookstores by Mark Leslie Lefebvre, who was actually one of my classmates. He was in my cohort as well, and he was our student speaker at graduation. He's a cool guy. He has a lot of books about writing and publishing and werewolves, not necessarily all in the same books, but, you know, across his writing career. Very useful for self-publishers and really interesting to see how bookstores and libraries work from the back end and how they acquire their books and what you can do as an author to build relationships with these institutions and get your books there. Really, it's all about sort of networking and knowing your community and being in touch with people. It probably means that I'm never going to get my books anywhere because I'm not good at that. This next book was also what I had to get for class, but not a publishing class. At Western Colorado University, all the first-year students in any creative writing concentration, aside from publishing, there's genre fiction, nature writing, screenwriting, and poetry, have to take this class called The Common Read, where we spend the summer semester talking about one book. Last summer, that book was Appropriate by Paisley Rekdal. As you can probably guess from the title, it's about cultural appropriation, and it's a very fun read. Okay, so reading this book was kind of a slog, and discussing it was actual misery. The number of times I had to hear white authors just casually admit that they had never once even thought about cultural appropriation as a concept was stunning, and so is how quick people are to diminish the value of their own art in order to avoid having to think about it too closely. Some authors, like Lionel Shriver, who I have whole beef with, and believe me, maybe one day I'll do a Lionel Shriver deep dive, and I'll just talk about her uniquely unpleasant, yet compelling books. But for now, I will just bring up the fact that she talked about cultural appropriation while wearing a sombrero, and really thought that she was cooking. Did I already tell the story in my Kate Corain video? I might have, because I cannot get over it. Like, she really thought Mexicans would be offended by this. Like, we haven't seen, like, white girls in sombreros aren't 70% of Mexico's tourism industry. You look like you're gonna buy a dollarita. We're over it. We're fine. Some authors, including Lionel Shriver, make this infuriating argument that there's artists TM on one side and people who care about cultural appropriation on the other, and that couldn't be further from the truth. How is it anti-art to recognize writing as an act of inherent power and to believe that authors should think critically about how they choose to wield it? Shouldn't artists welcome the opportunity to think about what they create and why from a new perspective? Doesn't art deserve to be challenged? Apparently not. Apparently some people don't think that way. But anyway, overall, I found Appropriate to be a useful, if bland, introductory text that can be useful to help authors codify their own set of ethics regarding appropriation in their writing. Apparently, though, enough people complained about having to read it that the administration promised to go with a less controversial pick for this year's Common Read. Honestly, I find that a little bit disappointing because did I have fun discussing cultural appropriation with primarily white people who resented the fact that they even had to be having these conversations? Absolutely not, but at least people had to think about the impact of their writing on marginalized communities, you know? So I recommend this book. I think it gives people a lot of information while still leaving them with the space to form their own opinions, and even if most people's opinions are that they don't care and never will, it won't hurt them to understand where the other side is coming from. For the record, I personally think cultural appropriation is unavoidable, and I don't think authors should avoid it. I just think they need to be careful and intentional about it, do their research, and avoid replicating harmful stereotypes. Also, as I talked about in my Kate Corain video, white authors also need to recognize that no matter how good the representation they write may be, it can't be allowed to crowd out representation from authors who are actually from marginalized communities. Now on to a more fun one. Angel Island by Inez Haynes Gilmore and edited by Kelsey Kuznetsky, and with a foreword by Rebecca Moesta, who happens to be Kevin's wife. So as you can see, this one has an absolutely gorgeous, stunning cover. I love the gold, I love the fallen angel. It's very striking, very legible. The bold text is very legible. The layout inside is very simple and clean. There's not a lot of flourishing going on, but that just makes it all the easier to read. Now, what is Angel Island about? Well, let me just read the cover copy that Kelsey wrote. Rediscover a 20th century classic of feminist fantasy. After surviving a shipwreck, 5 men are stranded on a deserted island until they are discovered by 5 beautiful winged women. Instantly, the men become infatuated with the women's abilities and attempt to lure them in with all the riches and treasures that washed ashore, letting their desires guide their decisions. Their plan unfolds, and their world changes forever. Inez Haynes Gilmore wrote over 40 books, many on the topics of women's issues in writing. Step or fly into the world that Inez Haynes Gilmore has created and rediscover the imaginary world of Angel Island. I think this is a really fascinating early feminist work. This is the first of many books we'll discuss today from the Wordfire Classics imprint, which you can see from the little logo here, which is where the books publishing students at Western put out end up being published. In addition to working on the anthology as a group, we each got to pick one public domain classic book to do a reprint of, and we basically work it over start to finish, proofing and editing, designing the layout of the interior, creating a cover, and coming up with marketing materials. This book was done by a student cohort above mine, and I chose to buy it at the book launch last year because I have a history with it. You see, I wanted to do Angel Island as my project, but I couldn't because Kelsey beat me to it. Ultimately, this is a good thing since I'm glad I ended up going with Of One Bly, but you best believe I was salty when I found out. Another project I considered before finding out it had already been done by Wordfire Classics was We by Evgeny Zamyatin. If I didn't already have it in English and Russian, I would consider getting the Wordfire Classics edition just to see what the student editor did with it, because I am curious. Another student book I got last year was The Japanese Fairy Book by Yae Theodora Ozaki, edited by Brianna Hollifer, with a foreword by Paul DiFilippo. I wanted this one before I even got to the book launch because I saw the cover on Facebook and it was so gorgeous. I just had to have it. Look how beautiful it is. The illustration is just so pretty. Like, I cannot believe this is stock art. Like, this looks like it was commissioned to be a book cover. It's so beautiful. I love the pink. I love the font. Everything about this cover is just so gorgeous. Interior of this book is also a treat because, guess what? It has illustrations. Here's one of them right now, but I am looking for a very specific one because I do have a favorite illustration in this book that I am delighted to share. Here it is. Okay. Here is a absolutely shredded rabbit man setting a badger on fire. If that doesn't tell you what you're in for with this book, I don't know what will. Basically, as the title implies, Japanese Fairy Book, it's a collection of Japanese traditional fairy tales, and these fairy tales are fucking violent. You always hear about Brothers Grimm fairy tales being violent. People are being beaten, set on fire, eaten by dragons, this, that, and the other. One story in particular that stands out is the story of why the jellyfish has no bones. Basically, the reason the jellyfish has no bones is because he betrayed the king, so he had his royal court beat him to a pulp. Good night, kids. Sweet dreams. Anyway, these stories are all a lot of fun. And even if this book didn't look absolutely amazing, even if it didn't have compelling material, I would have honestly gotten it anyway because it was the individual project of my friend Bree, who was super sweet to me at the first residency and really took me under her wing and made sure I felt comfortable. She was so nice, I would have gotten her book no matter which one it was, but it just so happened to be a really cool project, so it worked out for both of us. I also got A House of Pomegranates by Oscar Wilde, edited by Lila Hawley, with a foreword by Russell Davis at the same book launch. As you can see, this one has another absolutely stunning cover. Like, I am so jealous of the art some people were able to find for their books. I will talk about the process of designing my own cover later. Let's just admire what some of these other students were able to come up with. It's so pretty. It's so pretty. Now, this is a very short book. It's just a collection of, I think, 4 fairy tales by Oscar Wilde, and this is actually the first thing by Oscar Wilde I've ever read. I know, everyone on Earth has read Dorian Gray. Well, I haven't. I probably will at some point, but after reading this, I do like Oscar Wilde's style. Wilde style. Do you think they named the Lego Movie character after Oscar Wilde? I don't think they did. These stories are less violent, I would say, than the Japanese fairy book fairy tales, but they're also not for children, I would say. They're more mature, thoughtful. They're very clever little stories. Now, in addition to the gorgeous cover, I wanted to have this book because I wanted to support Lila. Just like the real publishing industry, the program at Western is overwhelmingly white, and I really felt for Lila as the only woman of color in her cohort. If you'd also like to support Lila, she currently runs her own publishing company, Camouflage Sisters, which publishes accounts by female veterans. The last book I got at the previous year's book launch was Merciless Mermaids, which was the previous cohort's anthology. Now, this one has a really cool cover. I think it was actually like a fish's tail, but they sort of sized it up to make it look like a mermaid. I love the calming blue of the cover. I think it's very mysterious, but also sort of menacing, like, because it looks like the tail has, like, it has these patterns on it, but they kind of look like scars. There's also a lot of fun things going on with the design of this book in here. Like, look, there's a little mermaid glyph between scene breaks. There's a scale overlay at the start of each chapter. It's really pretty. So it's a really pretty book inside and out. And as for the content, as the title implies, this is a collection of dark fantasy and a couple sci-fi stories featuring mermaids. This collection is delightfully twisted. For reference, one of these stories was affectionately referred to as the exploding eyeball story during the editing process, and it's only the second most fucked up story here. I love that. Also, I just love anything to do with the ocean and that whole aesthetic. As you can tell
for my seashells and glass floats.
I have the design sensibilities of an East Coast housewife just decorating a guest bathroom, but I also love darkness, death, and despair, so this anthology really hits all the marks for me. Some of my favorite stories are Europa's Children, The Last Ounce of Flesh, and Something Rare. At the most recent summer residency, I picked up a discounted copy of Gilded Glass, Fractured Fairy Tale collection. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I imagine it's in a similar, if slightly less dark vein as Merciless Mermaids, which is why I decided to pick it up. That and it has a truly gorgeous cover. I love the colors, I love the mirror. But I saved the best anthology for last, or did I? Real ones know where I'm going with this, but for now, let's talk about Feisty Felines and other fantastical familiars. I would give you a pitch, but there's already a trailer up on YouTube featuring an original soundtrack composed by me. And it does a way better job than I could, so I'm going to link it below. It's only a minute long and well worth the watch, but if you don't feel like checking it out, then this is a fantasy anthology about familiars, the animal companions to witches and wizards. Think black cats, but this anthology takes that familiar dynamic in all kinds of new directions with just about any animal you can imagine, except rabbits. And no, I'm not hurt by that. I'm not. So stories run the gamut from whimsical to funny to downright depressing at times, in my opinion. No exploding eyeballs, but some of my favorite stories feature a cat puppeteering a dead witch's body, a snake unwillingly transformed into a fluffy kitten, and a devoted spider trying to get her witch a girlfriend. More on that one later. I want to take you guys through producing an anthology, but first, let's just appreciate the book itself, because it's so cool. I mean, just look at this. And this, the cat's on the spine, the cat's on the back, the cat's on the rack, the cat's on the hat. Boom, boom, cat rap. I'm not gonna rap, don't worry. I will not subject you to that in this video. But the mixtape is dropping soon. Anyway, this is the cover for Feisty Felines and Other Fantastical Familiars designed by Alison Longuera. For the record, the students did get to vote on the art, but we didn't actually design it ourselves because obviously we all would have had completely different designs, so it was easier just to leave it to the professionals. Also, let's just take a close look here. You can see the cat, you can see the crow, you can see the spider. The spider is really special to me because the story I edited was the one about the spider, so it feels like I personally am represented on this cover. Spider that I am, me and my spider lights as well. It's really funny. You would think that because I edited the spider story and because I have spider lights back there that I'm not terrified of spiders, but you would be wrong. You can check out the poem A Memoir in Spiders on my website, which I'll link in the description. Everything's linked in the description. I have so many links in the description, you'd think I'm cooking sausage. Anyway, I will share that poem down below if you guys want to check it out. The point is, I am scared of spiders. I just like them in fiction and or $2 lights that I bought from garage sales. So, this is what the outside of the book. As for the interior, look! The scene breaks are these cute little cats, and you remember how every story in Merciless Mermaids had that scale overlay on the front? Well, these have a different overlay on every chapter. It's a new animal each time. Can you see that? It's a tapir. Tapir, taper. I don't know how you say it, but you know, it's the big, I think it's like South American or something. You can see this chapter has a cat. And I'm going to look for Some Spider by Pines Callahan, which has, you guessed it, a spider, but a very adorable, big-eyed, cute spider, so that's very fortunate. Each story has its own cute little overlay with the main character. This book is absolutely adorable and full of fun stories. So, how did we make this anthology? To start with, we had to decide on a theme, and I suggested that a bunch that were looking back a bit too high concept and overcomplicated. Ultimately, we landed on cat-themed, which then evolved into magical cats, which then evolved into fantastical cats, jellicle cats. Jellicles do as jellicles can. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. We workshopped the cat theme until we landed on Feisty Felines and Other Fantastical Familiars. Originally, we envisioned it as mostly cat stories with a few other animals sprinkled in for variety, but then we got so many strong stories featuring non-cat familiars that the final anthology has almost a perfect 50-50 split. Next, we had to come up with a call for submissions, which, as the name implies, is how you let authors know you're looking for stories. You have to provide firm guidelines as to what you are and are not looking for, otherwise Feisty Felines and Other Fantastical Familiars could very well end up becoming feisty furries and where to find them. How you write the call for submissions will impact the stories you receive. For example, in ours, we really emphasized stories with non-cat familiars and provided a lot of suggestions for those, which is why so many of our strongest submissions featured more unorthodox familiars, to the point where it was actually difficult in the end to make sure we had enough cat stories to justify the title and marketing. On the other hand, some people really will just submit whatever. We got so many stories that were about cat, not magical cats, just cats, like pets, regular old walking around animals. I think some people interpreted our call for submissions as saying we were looking for stories about feisty felines or fantastical familiars, which meant the cats didn't necessarily have to be familiars, but this wasn't the case, which led to a lot of stories that were otherwise decent being rejected because they just didn't fit what we were looking for. That's another thing about producing an anthology. So many stories will be rejected. We had between 300 and 400 submissions in our slush pile by the end of the process, which was apparently a lot less than previous years. Partially this was because our theme was announced later in the summer than past anthologies, so authors had less time to come up with something. Still, because Wordfire Press, the company publishing the anthology, was paying short story authors a professional rate of 6 cents per word, a lot of authors, including well-established ones, were willing to submit. Anthologies tend not to sell very well because no one cares about short stories, so it's important to have at least a few big names involved. Since Kevin himself is a big name in publishing, he was able to pull strings and talk to friends, get authors like Mercedes Lackey, Jody Lynn Nye, and the other authors displayed on the cover, which are called featured authors or marquee authors, you know, like the marquee on a movie theater, not like the marquee of France or whatever, the title of royalty. So we also got unexpected submissions from established authors like Steve Rasnick-Tem, who wasn't asked to be a feature author originally, but became one as soon as we decided to accept his story because he's such a big name. Apparently. I also did not know who Steve Rasnick-Tem was. There's that meme about not knowing any celebrities because all you do is watch Phineas and Ferb, and that's me, but it's not knowing any current sci-fi fantasy authors because all I do is read Illusion Defense. Anyway, most submissions will come from authors who are lesser known or maybe even haven't been published before. Like I mentioned earlier, that was the case with Matt Beswick. Is being written by an unknown author a strike against the story? Absolutely not. But being written by a known author is undeniably a plus and can lead to a story receiving special consideration. I won't name names because the story ended up not making it into the anthology, but one of the authors Kevin originally asked to feature wasn't sure they'd be able to do it, so they got their story in later than expected and it wound up in the slush pile. It was a weird story that stretched the definition of a familiar, and some people just found it off-putting. Personally, I thought it was an interesting read, but not the best fit for our anthology. Still, we were specifically asked to consider very carefully whether or not we would bend the rules to accept the story because the author was such a big name. The exact same story by an unknown author would not have been treated the same way. It just would have gone out immediately. Stories by Western alums were also marked for special consideration. We ran this anthology through a program called Moksha, which lets you flag stories for different reasons with the tagging system. Plenty of stories by alumni got rejected, but we had to flag them right at the beginning, so we remembered to include at least a couple stories from past students. Another primary consideration when choosing stories for an anthology is balance. You want a variety of different tones, different lengths, different cultures represented. Cat stories versus non-cat stories, to use a less universal example that came up quite a bit for Feisty Felines. We explicitly stated in our call for submissions that we wanted stories featuring various cultures and their unique animals and approaches to magic, and we got plenty of them. Some were pretty good, some were uncomfortable. There was one I remember where a character had a very distinct Mexican name that got changed to a white girl end by her adoptive family, and it was presented as a happy ending. Didn't love the implications of that one. But there were also stories that really drew from different traditions and cultural understandings of magic to create unique and compelling stories. Most editors were on the same board in terms of making sure we had a racially diverse pool of authors, but some other forms of marginalization weren't paid quite as much attention. Now, obviously, you can't make an author disclose if they're queer or disabled or anything like that, but if authors do volunteer this information, especially if it's relevant to the story, say a queer author writing a queer romance, it could very well be taken into consideration. No story is going to be accepted just because its author is marginalized, but when we have 50 plus stories that are all really good, we need to whittle it down to 25, being able to say, this story represents this marginalized group, can be a useful deciding factor. Some of my absolute favorite stories from the slush pile didn't make the final cut. Some of them were queer, or featured neurodivergent protagonists, or were culturally rich, and others were just fun. There was a story about a rabbit that I really liked, a cyberpunk story about a robot kitten looking for a wizard, and the first story I ever read in the slush pile, which featured the line, "Familiars are not Pokemon." Being on the editor side of the process really showed me how little a rejection has to do with the quality of writing. Sure, you might get rejected because your story is terrible and you should be ashamed of yourself, but you might also have written a really good story that just isn't what they're looking for in this specific context. Basically, the process was broken down into a few stages. At stage 1, me and my classmates were broken into groups of 3 and assigned a certain set of authors. My groups was last names A through E. This way, we wouldn't get overwhelmed by having to read every single story in the slush pile. At this point, each story received a rating of 1, 5, or 10. 1 meaning we definitely wanted to reject it, 5 meaning it could go either way, and 10 meaning we definitely wanted to keep. There were a lot of reasons the story could get a 1. Maybe it didn't fit the theme, maybe it wasn't in proper manuscript formatting, maybe it was just a slog to read. Some editors were hesitant to give out ones because it felt too mean, especially if it was to someone they knew, but I stuck to my judgment. Actually, the first rejection I ever had to write was one of the students in the cohort above mine. So this was someone I had met at the residency, and she was so nice. She was a sweet old lady, and I had to write her a rejection letter right off the bat. To her credit, she came back strong with a second submission that made it a lot further in the process, but ultimately just missed the final cut. When you're still in the early stages of a slush pile, at a certain point you have to trust your gut and make decisions fast, otherwise you're going to get bogged down by an impossible amount of reading and analyzing. Also, despite the temptation to see just how bad a story can get, if you're going to rate something a 1, just give it a 1 and move on. Don't waste your time being petty like I did without fail every single time, desperate to see how bad a story could get. Just move on. At the end of round 1, stories that mostly had 1s got rejected and stories with mostly 5s and 10s moved forward. At this point, we were still reading the same group of stories, in my case, the A through E authors, but instead of only 3 ratings from choose from, we now had a whole scale of 1 to 10, and we could afford to be more specific and selective with our ratings. At the end of this stage, any story below, I believe an average rating of either 7 or 7.5 would get rejected, and anything higher than that would move on to the next round, where all the student editors were reading all the stories. Now, I want to tell you the story of Some Spider. Some Spider by Pines Callahan is about a spider who becomes the familiar of a teen witch with arachnophobia and tries to win her over by getting her a girlfriend. The story is goofy yet heartfelt. In the beginning centuries, the spider's really interesting transition into sentience is it's called to be a familiar. I love the story from the very beginning because it felt like it not only featured a familiar, but really got to the heart of what it means to be one. I also love the humor and LGBT representation, so I gave it a 10, and I got 5s or 10s from my classmates and made it to the second round. In round 2, I rated it highly, but my classmates were more middle of the road. I don't think anyone actively disliked it, it just wasn't a firm favorite. Its average ranking ended up either right at 7 or just below. At this point, Some Spider would have been rejected, but I chose to make it my save, meaning I flagged it as safe in Moksha and guaranteed it would make it to the final round. Like I said, in the final round, everyone is reading every story. The average rating for Some Spider went up a bit, but it wasn't sweeping 10s across the board or anything. Then came the smackdown call. To make the final cut from the 50 or so stories left down to ultimately I think we wound up with 26. Anyway, the whole class hopped on a 2-hour Zoom call where we discussed the stories that remained and decide which would stay and which would go. There were a few stories that were pretty unanimously high rated that made it in without much discussion, or stories our professors wanted included for one reason or another, but after that it was a free-for-all. There were still far too many stories left for us to discuss the merits of every single one, so instead, each student got to pitch one story to the class and argue their case. I chose to argue for Some Spider, and it went from being one of the lower to middle ranked stories going into the SmackDown to being voted into the anthology. Part of this goes back to what I was saying about representation earlier. Even without the queer representation, this still would have been a delightful story, but when giving my pitch, being able to say, we don't have any other LGBT stories in contention at this point, and I think it's important that we include this in the anthology, was really useful in getting my classmates to vote it in. I also just felt very fulfilled personally in getting to advocate for this story and this author. I chose to go into publishing with the goal of making the industry more accessible for marginalized authors, so this is exactly the type of work I want to be doing. Also, I love this story so much that with the author and publisher's permission, I decided to print out little illustrated pamphlets of the story and hand them out at a local Pride festival. I wish I had a copy to show you, but I gave them all out, and I don't feel like printing out another one in color because I don't have that kind of money. So was this a form of marketing for the anthology as a whole? Yes, but it was also a very sincere way for me to try and bring the story into contact with a community that I knew would appreciate it. And I don't want it to seem like I'm in any way diminishing the author's hard work and talent by bringing up my own part in having this published. If the story wasn't strong enough to stand on its own merits, it would have been rejected no matter how much I was pulling for it. Not every story my classmates chose to argue for made the final cut. It just goes to show how fierce competition can be. Your story might be genuinely well written, exactly what the publication is looking for, and one of the editor's personal favorites, and still not make it in for any number of reasons, just because it doesn't happen to fit the delicate balance of the anthology as a whole. Anyway, Stan Pines Callahan, follow them on Twitter. Once we had our final story selected, we got to write acceptance letters and work with our authors on edits. Now, we were told to edit with a very, very light hand here, so there wasn't any kind of developmental editing, like restructuring plot, changes in character, or anything like that. Really, we were just making sure it fell in line with Wordfire Press's style guide and the aforementioned Ms. Chicago Manuel. After the author made their final edits, we got the story back and had to proof the layout, making sure there weren't any loose lines hanging out at the beginning or the end, that the page numbers were correct and in the right place, all that sort of thing. We also had to edit and proof manuscripts of our individual projects and exchange them with a couple of our classmates just to get another pair of eyes in there. The two projects I worked on were The King in Yellow, I knocked my hat over. The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, forward by Sean Braney and Andrew Lehman, co-founders of the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, good pull there, and edited by Ryan Connolly, who didn't put his name on the cover, so lucky I remembered it. I remember you, Ryan, I got your back. And then the other one I had to edit and proof was The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth by H.G. Wells, forward by Paul DiFilippo, edited by Emily Thiessen, who also didn't put her name on the cover. We had the option to do it or not, and I chose to put mine on the cover. So I wanted to get these because I worked on them, but they also have two of the most gorgeous covers out of the entire crop, so it worked out for me. So The King in Yellow is a short story collection by an author that inspired Lovecraft, and the first four of which center around a plague that drives people insane. And The Food of the Gods is about a scientific discovery that leads to animals, plants, and people becoming giant with equally giant consequences for mankind. Like I said, I wanted copies of these because I worked on them, so if you get a copy for yourself and you notice typos in them, no you didn't, shut up, I'm in your walls. I also want to take a moment to point out that Emily made bookmarks for Food of the Gods with the cover art, and they're absolutely gorgeous. We also designed Feisty Felines bookmarks that we gave out at the launch, and then I want to shout out Brianna Gardner, who was in charge of the decor, which is why I have this witch hat. We had them as centerpieces on some of the tables, and at the end she was trying to get rid of them, so she gave me and my friend a pair, so you know I'm rocking the witch hat. Before I get into my individual projects, since it'll probably take a while, I want to highlight two other books I got at my cohort's book launch this July. Phantastes by George MacDonald with a forward by Paul DiFilippo. I didn't even realize Paul DiFilippo did the forward for this and Food of the Gods, but that's interesting, good for him. Edited by my friend and fellow sci-fi writers of the future honorable mention winner, Josh Smizer. While you losers end up wherever your afterlives are, me and Josh are kicking it in Scientology heaven with our main man Elron. And The House on the Borderland, by William Hope Hodgson, with a foreword by Jonathan Mayberry, edited by Jen Furr, which is a pen name. I'm going to try and remember to use that and not her real name moving forward, since she chose to put that on the cover. So, as you can tell, this one has one of the most absolute gorgeous covers. I think House on the Borderlands has my absolute favorite cover out of any in my cohort, with King in Yellow being a close second. I just love the colors of this one so much. Like, I can't wait to display it on my shelf forever, and I can't wait to read it because it sounds like it's just a bunch of very weird, wacky adventures. And I think it has a cute layout. Look, it has a little subtle gradient on each chapter, and the page numbers have like a little planet decal next to them. I'm trying to get it close enough to the camera where you can see it, but basically it's like a little retro, it's like a little, it's a house. It's a house and a little planet and some stars, and that's on every page, so that's super cute. That's a fun detail. I don't think anyone else did that. I didn't even know you could do that in Vellum, so I don't think anyone else in the class did it, but it's really interesting. Apparently this chapter is called The Dark Nebula, which I'm very excited to read, so can't wait to check this out. This one was apparently a bitch to format because it has a lot of poetry and songs incorporated in it, and I know the pain because Of One Blood was the same way. Now, I wanted to get a copy of this because Josh complained about it so much that I had to find out for myself if it's really that as boring as he says, which is some clever reverse psychology marketing on his part. And I wanted The House in the Borderlands because, like I said, it has such a stunning cover. Two last quick ones I want to get out of the way are Drawing Out the Dragons by James A. Owen, who will be relevant later, and Science Fiction Poetry, edited by Steve Resnick-Tem, who wrote Old Crow is featured in Feisty Felines and Other Fantastical Familiars. These books are both freebies they were giving out at the residency this year. I haven't had a chance to read Drawing Out the Dragons yet, but I have read a couple poems from this anthology, and the very first one actually has made me cry. Not on the first read, but the more I sat with it, the more I really felt it. And now it might be one of my favorite poems ever, which isn't saying that much since I haven't gone out of my way to read a poem since high school, but still. The poem is called Missionary by D.M. Thomas, if for anyone who's interested. I highly recommend reading it. Now on to the big one. Of One Blood by Pauline E. Hopkins, forward by Eden Royce, editing by me. Surprise, surprise, Solaris is not my real legal name. I don't know why I didn't put it on the cover. I think I just figured that my family friends on Facebook that my parents would guilt trip into buying it would be like, Solaris, who's that? So I just left it as my actual name. At any rate, this was my capstone project, my thesis, my little baby, who's all grown up and available for purchase from Wordfire Press, link in the description. Sponsored by Skillshare. Just kidding. No one would ever sponsor me in a million years. Anyway, When we had to choose a book in the public domain to reprint, it took me quite a while to find one that I liked. Aside from Russian literature, I pretty much only read anything pre-1920s if you hold a gun to my head, so I didn't really have any public domain faves that I was just burning to publish. Like I mentioned earlier, I liked the idea of doing Angel Island, or We, but those had already been taken, so instead I just googled books in the public domain, went to sci-fi/fantasy, and clicked on every single option that came up until I came across Of One Blood. What is Of One Blood? Well,
one generation removed from slavery, African-American author Pauline E. Hopkins defied the racist paradigms of her time and challenges the convention of our own when women of color are still fighting for representation in genre fiction. Of One Blood, a story of secret identities, hidden treasures, and exploration, blends early sci-fi, historical fiction, and gothic horror into one unforgettable adventure.
basically, this book is weird. It's kind of early sci-fi, it's kind of gothic horror, it's kind of an adventure novel, and it's kind of a mess, but it is a thrilling ride all the way through. I decided to do this book because I love the idea of highlighting a forgotten classic by a person of color, especially a work like Of One Blood, which has been foundational. But I was genuinely surprised by how much I enjoyed reading it, given the fact that, like I said, not the biggest fan of turn-of-the-century books. In some ways, this book is very of its time, but in others, it would be ahead of its time if it came out today. I'm glad I got the opportunity to honor Pauline E. Hopkins like this, and hopefully make a few more people aware of her amazing legacy. The main ways producing these reprints differed from the anthologies were that we were responsible for finding a forward author, and we got to design the covers ourselves. A foreword is basically an introduction to a book written by someone other than the author, and we needed to include these to set the Wordfire Press editions apart from the source text in order to justify the reprint. Choosing a forward author was a little challenging for me. In addition to just separating your book from the source text, the forward is an opportunity to provide fresh context on your work and explain why people should care about it. Ideally, you should get a forward author who's knowledgeable about the genre or author or even the book itself, and hopefully they have an audience of their own that they can mobilize in order to drive up sales. I didn't know anyone who fit the bill, but fortunately a different member of my cohort was friends with Black Gothic horror author Eden Royce and put me in touch with her. She obviously understood the significance of this book and Hopkins' work and brought her own personal experience as a Black woman writing genre fiction into it. Her story of having to defend her presence in a primarily white creative space really resonated with me as someone who majored in creative writing in fucking Wisconsin. And the fact that Eden's search for belonging has led her and other authors to Pauline E. Hopkins really shows how important it is that we uphold foundational marginalized authors like this, so those of us who are struggling in the present can look back and see that we have always been a part of these spaces and we always will be. If you would like to support Eden Royce, her latest book, The Creeping of Dogwood House, is out and I will have it linked in the description. It's like a scholastic book fair in there. Another challenge was designing the cover. This book's imagery is so varied that it was pretty hard to find a central image I wanted to showcase. One thing I knew I wanted to avoid was having an animal on the cover. There were some pretty striking scenes involving a leopard and a lion, but I didn't want to fall into the Disney Princess and the Frog, Brother Bear type deal where stories about people of color end up being primarily represented by animals. So eventually I landed on the Moreau Pyramids, as seen here, since the book's second half takes place in and around them, but this presented its own difficulties because there's only one stock photography website we were allowed to use because it was the only one really vetting AI. There were not a lot of images to choose from. There were a ton of options for the Great Pyramids, but those are located in a completely different part of Africa, so you can't just exchange one for the other. The Moreau Pyramids also have a very distinctive shape that sets them apart. Eventually, I was able to find the image you see here. I felt like the gathering storm was able to hint at the darkness of the book, the perilous nature of the adventure story, and the broody horror atmosphere. One thing you need to keep in mind when designing a cover nowadays is how it's going to look as a thumbnail. More and more people are buying books online. If they can't see from a teeny tiny image what the cover says and what it's about, they're less likely to buy it. The font I chose here is called Antiquarian, which I felt like got the old-fashioned adventure feeling across, and it's nice and big and thick so you can easily read it at just about any size. Originally, I wanted the text in red to represent the blood and Of One Blood, but it made the cover too dark overall, whereas this dingy whitish gold here is a lot more illegible. We created our covers using Adobe InDesign, and there's definitely a learning curve, but if you have any kind of digital art, photo manipulation experience, you should be able to get by. There's a ton InDesign can do that I personally haven't even messed with yet, and I have friends like Alex Hale, who along with Josh, who I mentioned earlier, is starting his own publishing company, Blue Feather Quill. A lot of authors and people in the industry will design book interior layouts in InDesign. For class, though, we use a software called Vellum. Now, Vellum is incredibly easy to use, but it's also very limited. Good fucking luck if you want to do anything super fancy with your layout. Godspeed if you use too many hyphens. Heaven forbid you should try to publish a poetry collection. I just shudder at the thought of that. My book included songs and poems here and there, and it was so annoying to try and get everything aligned properly. However, even a tech-illiterate moron like me was able to get the hang of vellum pretty easily, so much so that I was able to format ebook and print version of The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane in like a week, so I could get the print version done in time for my girlfriend's most recent birthday. It's her favorite book, and I got to do a reprint of it. Brr. Anyway, vellum, however, was not used in the production of the final book I'm going to show you today, and my crowning achievement, dun 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 dun, Feisty Fanfics and Other Fantastical Fables. See if you can spot the difference. Fun fact, I sent my brother a picture of this cover, and he thought it was the actual anthology. Imagine getting your master's degree, going to school for a year, spending 20 grand, and they teach you to make this. I know that's kind of what happened, but this was a side project for fun and games that I arranged with my classmates, not this, which is an actual product that you can buy and purchase and adore and admire and pass down to future generations. We only made enough copies for the class and the professors, so you will never get to read these stories. You're not missing out in my case. I wrote a story called Seed of the Dragon. I'm going to show you my cover here in a second. Seed of the Dragon, Even Stranger Romance, Volume 69, a fiery tale of true love and lust. New York Times best-selling author Kevin J. Anderson wishes he wrote this. I'm proud of that cover. I'm also proud of this cover. I did design this one as well, and Catboy Kevin loomed large in my mind for several months before this was made, so I'm really glad I got to do it. Also, meow. I made a fake ISBN. That's supposed to be a real ISBN. I don't know why it doesn't have anything there, but anyway, it's an IBBS because it be BS. And I didn't put any numbers there because I didn't know if you could get arrested for ISBN fraud. I still don't know that to this day. Anyway, this book is an absolute marvel. Every single person in the cohort contributed to it in some way, either by writing a story, proofing and editing, designing covers, or contributing to the interior layout. I want to give a special shout out to Alex Hale, who I just mentioned as the InDesign Wonderkind, because he, in addition to leading the design team and the cover team, he really brought this thing to life. He was the one who ordered and printed all of them and brought them to the residency, and he was the one who made this a reality, because I was kind of on the fence on whether I was going to do it or not. I was like, it would be fun, but I don't know if anyone really has the time. I don't know if people would follow me into a project like this. And while I was sort of dithering on it, Alex, who I had told the idea, wouldn't it be fun? Alex goes and announces it when we're at dinner with the whole cohort, we're doing a parody anthology. So we did a parody anthology, and the two of us worked together, sort of the head editors of the whole thing, keeping everyone else in line. And everyone else did not want to get in line. Everyone else did not like following deadlines. Everyone else was late all the time. It turns out authors are not good at following deadlines. Who'd have guessed? But anyway, it all came together in this final product that is a labor of love and also a catastrophe. It's very beautiful. Each story has its own unique cover design, which I think is really cool, and that's meant to be a tribute to Alison Longira, who is a professional cover designer. And then the stories are parodies based off of Kevin's work. The Clockwork series that I mentioned earlier, the Dan Shamble Zombie series, and then I parodied two of his works called Spine of the Dragon, which is where I get the title Seed of the Dragon, and Dragon Business, which is another original series of his. The reason I consider this such an achievement is that it really feels like my baby in a way that even the individual project doesn't, because everyone did an individual project, but this was something that, that I and Alex took and the rest of the class took initiative on and decided to do just because of the sheer passion we had for publishing and because we wanted to bring this project to life. So it's really special to me for that reason, and I'm always going to cherish this chaotic, horrible cat boy nightmare.
Hi, I just want to pop in while I'm editing and add a few things. So first of all, I just want to say that every single book on this table, every book that I discussed today, was not published by Penguin Random House. Woo! Penguin Random House, more like Penguin Random Hoomst, bitch. Anyway, I also want to say that I'm so focused on the publishing process, they didn't even really talk about the wonderful experience that I had being a part of this cohort. We really all did our best to support one another, and even now that the program is over, I've still been exchanging stories back and forth with Josh, because we're both submitting to the new cohort's anthology, Confounding Cupids, which, now that I think about it, I probably should have link in the description, so in case anyone wants to submit a story to it. And then also me and a different member of my cohort are doing word sprints later today, and it's just so cool to have a bunch of writer friends. You know, I'm someone who generally rolls my eyes when I hear the word community because I am the creep and the weirdo that Radiohead sang about, but I genuinely have connected with a lot of these people, and I think that's important to know going into the program, is that you will make friends whether you like it or not. Anyway, back to the video.
If there's interest, I can definitely make more videos in the future going more in depth on various parts of the publishing process, so just let me know in the comments if that's something that you want to see. If not, don't worry, I'll make videos about plenty of other things you're not interested in. One of these days, I'm going to have to talk about the Enderverse. Like I said, I might do a Lionel Shriver deep dive at some point. Maybe I'll talk about books and authors I actually like. Who knows? The world is my oyster now that I have a master's degree. Thank you for joining me on this arduous journey. I have been Solaris on the air, and if you would also like to be Solaris on the air, you can like, comment, subscribe, and wear my skin. Thank you. Goodbye.